1 year ago, America was stunned again. Another massacre at another school, this time at Marjory, Stoneman, Douglas High in Parkland, Florida. And this time, it was different. Surviving students became vocal, and they've driven a year-long conversation about guns. But our new poll with NPR and the PBS NewsHour demonstrates their impact has waned a bit. We're going to look inside the numbers to explain what's happening. And then it turned to 2020, Lee's favorite subject. With new candidates announcing nearly every week, we wanted to explore what the electorate will look like that they're going to face. It's time to Poll Hub. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Marigoff, Director of the Marist Institute for Public Opinion.
Last winter, we sat in this room, in this studio, and talked about what had happened in Parkland, Florida. And I do remember having covered, as a reporter, too many of these kinds of stories and having watched them, as we all have, as consumers of journalism, that this one seemed remarkably powerful and that the kids seemed remarkable in ways that we had not seen before. The kids in other shootings, remarkable in their own ways, but this was different. And a year later, we went out into the field to poll what Americans' opinions about gun restrictions and some other things are. And I'll just give it away. At least the highlight to me is that, and it's not a surprise based on everything that's happened in the past and previous incidents, the anger about that hasn't really stuck. Is that fair?
Well, I think that's true. And what we see in the survey results of Americans that we did with our partners, NPR and the PBS NewsHour, is that I'm not so sure it's about the anger as much as it's about the urgency. And so when we ask people whether gun reform is a priority, an immediate priority for Congress, that gets put in the context of the latest news. And, we're still, talking shutdown and wall and negotiating.
And the news cycle moves so fast now. There's an outrage every day.
And so when we look, though, about how many and what proportion of Americans see this as a priority overall for Congress, the numbers are identical. 71% feel it's a priority, maybe not necessarily an immediate one, and that's the same proportion of people who said the same thing just a year ago. So I think there is still that concern that something has to be done. In fact, we also looked in this poll and asked people about whether they feel that the priority should be on controlling gun violence or protecting gun rights. And that is something we have seen that has really grown since Newtown, right after Newtown when we polled that in 2013.
The desire to control gun violence as opposed to protecting gun rights.
And so we've seen that grow from a question that was very divided in the high 40s just after Newtown to one where there is a very solid majority, 58% of Americans, believe that we should focus on containing and controlling gun violence rather than on protecting gun rights.
Yeah, I think, and also the survey last year, as you indicate, was right immediately in the aftermath of that horrific event. And so that would make sense that the sensitivities would be at their highest. But I think also, there's a lot of things in this survey that are instructive or directive for where we should go from here as a nation. And although some people are not as into gun control necessarily in the abstract in terms of Congress having it be a urgent matter, we do see in specifics, which we asked about, there is a consensus. So in terms of background checks, 82%. In terms of mental health checks, 79%. Armed guards in the school, 72%.
Haven't these been the case for a long time, though, these kinds of numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only one of this that did not score highly was this notion that, kicked around social media that we should arm teachers in the schools, only 39% on that. So when it comes to the specifics, there has been a consensus, and that's still there. And I have a funny feeling we're going to hear a little bit more about this in the 2020 presidential campaign than maybe we have in some others. And then I think digging into the data, we saw other kinds of things, not just age. I mean, this is something that young people are especially tuned into, but we saw some other matters also showing
A lot of differences. Obviously, we saw differences in terms of political party. I mean, there is a pretty wide divide between Republicans and Democrats, and I don't think that was surprising. But we also did see very large differences between white Americans and non-white Americans, and particularly with regard to the urgency of whether this is an issue that should be addressed. And also we asked questions about their concern and their sense of safety in their local communities. And I think that's where we saw some of the biggest differences.
And what were the differences on race, for instance?
Well, for instance, non-white Americans are much more likely to feel a lack of safety in their schools. They're much more likely to be concerned about the fact that something like this might happen in their community, and also the intensity. When we asked about whether this was something that they were concerned about a great deal, 28% of non-white Americans said that they had a great deal of concern about this kind of issue happening in their community, whereas only 13% of white Americans felt the same way.
Let me circle back to where we started, which was the kids that made such a difference early on, that were very vocal, very, very mature in their response and in the way they directed it. There was a lot of accusations at the time that they were too coached and all of these kinds of things. But a year later, what do Americans feel about these kids?
Yeah, and again, right now, a 58% favorable response to the Parkland kid students.
Have a favorable impression.
Yeah,
of
favorable
what
impression
they
of
have
them. 67% among those who are under 29. And again, as Barbara was just indicating, 86% among Democrats. And the other thing is, part of the reaction to the Parkland shooting in terms of what the students there have done, 64% of the survey said that they've had some impact moving the discussion or in actually getting people to act in ways that they want, and 18% feel that that's been a major impact. So I think when we think about the mobilization of young people, which has occurred. We saw it in the midterm elections. We saw a surge in turnout among people under 30, much greater than any age group. I think we're seeing a change in how people are connecting to their population and into these issues, and I think that is really owing to what these kids, remarkable people have done.
Are digital natives, and I think that's made a big difference. Let me flip it real quick before we move on to the next topic. The NRA. If that's the flip side of the kids, that may be too simplistic.
Although I even hate to call them kids. I mean, because they're young adults, and certainly
fair enough.
They showed maturity way beyond their years.
Yeah, fair enough. What about the NRA? They say they're bankrupt. They're facing bankruptcy. There's been a lot of news about the NRA with some Russia money and all that over the last year. Where do they stand?
Well, I think one of the issues that has really come to pass over the last couple of years with these dramatic and horrific events that have happened, Newtown, Las Vegas, Parkland,
the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, another one in Florida. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so what we see is that the NRA, up until probably about this last year, has had a more positive than negative rating among Americans as a whole. A majority of Americans, and for a long time, most Americans had a positive impression of the organization. What we saw in this poll was something that was somewhat dramatic, which was that it was now quite divided. 42% of Americans had a positive impression, and 42% had a negative impression. And I think that does speak to the fact that they have gotten into the fray.
And I just want to point out the negative didn't change in that it's the positive that went down. More people were unsure. So people who don't like it NRA stayed about the same, but people like them really took a dive on that. And so I think that's something to look at in those particular numbers. There was one other thing I thought, Barb. I don't know if you wanted to say anything more on the NRA, but there was the one thing I thought was an interesting question. When you first hear about a shooting, do you think about stricter gun control, or do you think about more people carrying guns? Because that's sort of what happens. People divide very quickly on that.
Well, that becomes certainly the social media debate,
Yes.
and a lot of our discussion of the.
And as far as the American people are concerned, it's not a contest. It is stricter gun control. And that's what people want when it's up against people carrying more guns.
Although I don't think it's about gun ownership. I think it's about having some rules, legislation, and regulations which people have referred to as common sense, rules and regulations, which, Lee, you had
We
talked
talked about.
in terms of background checks, and also just having fewer access to clips that can do a lot of damage.
And for good or ill, this is not going to be a discussion that's going to go away. We're going to, fortunately or unfortunately, be revisiting this, I'm sure, down the road.
So I was going to date myself in this segment and do a Barbara Wawa imitation of 2020, but I wouldn't. Well, I just did. This is your favorite topic, Lee.
That was a pretty bad imitation.
Yeah, well, that's why I was never on SNL. This is your favorite topic,
Yeah.
and with new candidates jumping in every hour? Have we had anybody in the last hour? It's worth discussing, and I think there's an interesting way of looking at it that we're going to look at right now, which is who's the electorate, because it's not 2016.
No, and it's been shifting. We're looking here at a study that was done by the Pew Research Center, taking an early look at the 2020 electorate. Yeah, and we know, we've talked in other podcasts about campaigns having to adjust to technological changes in campaigning, social media, for example, or political events, things that occur. And one of the areas that clearly requires flexibility on all the campaign's part is the shifting of the political demography that they're going to face election to election. And this one coming up, no exception. We're seeing a third of the electorate this time will be comprised of non-white voters, the largest we've ever had. And by way of comparison, if you think back when Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, which I know is now quite a few years ago, 87% of that electorate was white and only 13% were people of color. And now we're talking 20% more. 33% are likely to be people of color in this electorate.
Oh, not just 20% more, 20 points
20
more.
points more.
And, 1.5 times that number.
And the growth is really
2.5 times.
most pronounced in terms of Latino Americans. In 2000, the famous Gore-Bush election, the Florida overtime one, 7% were Latino. We expect in 2020 that number to be 13%, even surpassing the number of voters who are African American. So it's a different environment, a different political landscape, and given that the parties really vary in terms of their composition, in terms of their diversity, this is not without consequence.
What interests me is that Ron Brownstein's talked a lot about the different ways you break up demographic groups and how you look at them in 2020 versus 2016 or 12 or 2008 when Barack Obama won. I love looking at it as an age
Me
thing
too.
because it's striking when you do polls among the age groups how much the age groups line up. They're certainly outliers. And there's some racial implications to that for boomers versus Gen X or millennials. But it's striking to me that in 2020, the largest group are still going to be boomers, but by only a point. Millennials will be 27% of the electorate, and 25% will be Gen X, and 10% are going to be Gen Z, if that's what we're calling them.
They're going to be a larger proportion than people who are over 72 years of age, which are the silent generation. And for the first time, they're likely to be the smallest proportion of the electorate.
I detect some excitement in your voice and in Jay's voice over the fact that boomers are now
Getting rid of all the caucus?
Yeah.
Pew actually mentioned that boomers peaked in 2004.
I peaked in 2004 too. I've
It
been
was a good
downhill
year.
ever since.
It was a good year.
It was a good year.
There is one thing that I think is important to note here. It's really easy when you're talking to people who don't look at this real closely to look at these numbers and go, Democrats are Senate. The Democrats, this is a Democratic map. I just don't buy that necessarily, partly because Hispanics don't vote as a bloc, and not just Cubans in Florida. Hispanics that have been in the country longer, they vote more conservatively. There's a lot of research that shows they'll vote social issues over economic issues, or at least on par with them. So I think it's easy to look at this and draw simple conclusions, but I don't think we should.
I think that's a really good point, because also as people age, they generally do tend to become more conservative as they own homes, pay taxes, are more concerned
Absolutely.
with public schools. There is that change, and we have seen that with the Gen Xers, because they're now, the Gen Xers are now 38 to 53. And so they're really, they're really that middle group where if we looked back to 2004, that's about when, the boomers were peaking in their participation.
Can you stop talking about 2004 and boomers were peaking? I just feel we should move on from that.
Well, we are moving on,
Yeah,
and I
I
think
know.
that what we're looking at is to see that Gen Xers may also be defining this electorate as well.
Well, let me add one little point on this in all seriousness, because the boomers are down to 28. If you take the Gen Z folks, the youngest age group, and the millennials, who we've heard so much about in our politics, combined 37%. So we're talking about a young electorate.
Well, that's eligible voters.
Yeah, and the candidate, but with the turnout going up in those age groups, if they are engaged, and we were talking about, in the last segment about, turnout being high in the midterm elections about that age group. If that's the case, it doesn't automatically convert into a Democratic win or Republican loss, but the candidate is going to have to deal with some of the issues with some of those folks in order to be
The
successful.
one thing we're going to know that we can say right now is that polling is going to be really hard because the electorate is going to be different than it has been, and a lot of polls are going to do a lot of things to try and guess what the electorate is. We don't do that, but I bet there's going to be more junk polls, and we're going to be talking about more junk polls this cycle than we did last cycle. That's my bet.
Before we go, there is an important topic that we all buy into in one way or another. Was it about taxes and weather?
Death and taxes,
not
kind
exactly.
of, but we'll add weather
that
into
is
that.
one
Why
of-
don't well, that's also something you don't do a whole lot about. Anyway, people have asked, Huffington Post did recently, about seasons, winter, spring, summer, or fall, and we all have reactions to that. What is the season you could skip if you had the chance? Not surprisingly, it's winter. Duh, look out the window. I mean,
Well,
this
you're
is
in the
rough.
Northeast, Lee.
Yeah.
Although, I was really surprised, and I do enjoy talking about the weather. And I am not a winter fan. I don't do a lot of winter sports. I'm pretty much a 3-season kind of gal. So I was really heartened here to see that I was not alone, and that 45% of Americans agreed with me that if they could skip a season, it would be winter. But it's really driven by people who live in the Northeast and the Midwest.
And people who are
that's
over
where
65,
we have winter.
we can go right back to the age stuff, right? A majority of those over 65 years of age, winter's the one they can do without.
Well, how cool too, and Jay, I know you spent a few years in Southern California.
I was born there. Yeah.
And so I thought it was really interesting how our neighbors to the west look at the different seasons. Do they even have
Well, that's the
defined?
thing. When you look at this number, and 37% of those in the West, which is the plurality, say wouldn't skip any of them, it's because they don't have any. I mean, you do if you live up in Lake Tahoe or you live up in the mountains. But look at Seattle. Now, they just did get snow, but it never snows in Seattle. It's very rare. Their winter is rainy. It's not pleasant, but it's not winter like we have winter. So, I mean, the West is sparsely populated in the areas that have 4 seasons, relatively sparsely populated. So when you talk about the West and the people we're talking to, most of them live in Arizona or they live in L.A. or San Francisco. And 4 seasons are great because they don't have any.
I thought it was interesting, too, that in the South, almost a quarter of Southerners wouldn't mind skipping a summer or two.
Yeah, and I just want to point out something, that we are really good as a group here because we've actually talked about weather, and we did not bring up the whole topic of climate change, and we're not going to on this segment either. We'll bring it another time.
And that'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College here in wintry Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Kenny Marples down the table is our editor.
And we would like to thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell University, who provide us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades, and some of the other polls that we looked at today. Quite different. Pew and what else did we? HuffPost.
HuffPost, YouGov.
Yeah, helpful stuff.
Yeah, good stuff. So send your comments, send your questions to pollhub@marist.edu, or reach out on social media. Kenny and the gang are always checking social media to find out what's going on, and so you can talk directly with Kenny and.
Can we give out his cell phone number? Is that what we're doing?
And his friends. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter or Marist Poll on Facebook, and you can make both Mary, Kenny, and all of us really
Our whole
happy
newsfeed team, they're waiting to hear from you.
if you just subscribe. See you next time.